Guys, welcome to PowerTalk. It is really good to have both of you here, people who I respect and I've known for a while. Would you just like to introduce yourself and tell us about who you are and what you do?
All right, I'll be age before beauty. Okay. Leroy Logan, retired Met police officer, did 30 years from 1983 to 2013. And can't believe it's been 6 years already. I've local guy from Islington. Thought I was going to go down the road of science, but ended up in the police. But that helped me to navigate through the challenges. And I suppose one of the main things was being involved in the Black Police Association, being a founder member, and I suppose the input in the McPherson inquiry and everything that came out of that. So yeah, that's roughly who I am. Still involved in the struggle for equality and justice.
Amazing.
John Sutherland. I'm husband to one, dad to three, live in Brixton, and I was a Met officer for over 25 years. Retired last February. And my last operational job was as the borough commander for Southwark. Amazing.
And let's not forget the book that you put out recently. Well, not even, that was about a year ago now, was it?
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Do you want to just tell us what it's about? And
yeah, so I wrote a book called Blue, a memoir. And I wrote it while I was still serving. I had some kind of sense that, I don't know, I had a duty almost to tell the world beyond policing about the world that policing reveals. Because as police officers, I talk often about the painful privilege of policing, is that you venture repeatedly into the hurting places. And so I wanted to tell some of those stories. But also I wanted to tell a personal story. The reason I left the Met earlier than planned was because I got sick. And so the book also tells the story of my breakdown and of my recovery.
And it's an amazing story. Thank you. I'm excited just to have you guys here. One of the things that Power to Fight, what we like to do is collaborate, bring different voices to the table. And I think we can't really talk about youth violence or knife crime without having a conversation about the police and their involvement, what they do, what they bring to the table. And that's what I just want us to do, really. Let's just try and get your opinions about what's going on. So various stats will say that youth violence is going up. Knife crime is going up. The community feeling is something which is, some people would say, is at an all-time low around how the police may engage with the issue. I'd love to just get your view on it. It'd be interesting just to take us back a little bit. Is this a new phenomena? What are some of the reasons why we're in this place? Police responses, what do you think? What can we do? It'd be just great just to hear your opinions on those things.
Well, knife crime is as old as crime itself, really, you know. It has been a weapon of choice for many centuries. Obviously, guns came in through time. But I remember monitoring knife crime as far back as the late 90s. Because through my Black Police Association work, we were doing a lot of Black History Month events. And we'd have a sort of outreach bus going to different boroughs, north and south of London. And as a result of that, we started to pick up quite worryingly this propensity to use knives. And more than just the places you would expect it to be. So this was outside my sort of primary role, because at that time I was in Westminster, and I was thinking, you know, what's going on here? So as a result of that, we developed a youth leadership program called Voyage Youth. And that's pitched at Year 9 students for them to know their rights and responsibilities. So it's building relationships with the police, as well as them knowing how to pick up negative peer pressure, how to be a positive peer role model, and more importantly, to understand how to work with organisations, the police, etc. Now that's been running since 2001 and it's still going 18 years later. So we have had this sort of convolution of knife crime and how it's, has been, it's been worrying recently
It's not a new thing now.
It's nothing new. But the two things, because I think the worst knife crime was in 2008, 29 teenagers, etc., and it was terrible. And there was a response. And one of the main responses was we had safer neighbour teams then. So they were able to connect with communities, and they would do it on a regular basis. So there was that capacity to have intervention and prevention programs. And, even the borough command units, the borough commander, his superintendents would have even some seed money to help organisations, grass organisations, say, listen, you're doing some great stuff, let's encourage you, let's try. And that, again, fostered relationship. Here we are now, safer neighbour teams have been decimated. They're a third of what they were in terms of numbers.
What are the stats? I mean, we hear different stats. What are the stats of we hear about police cuts, but what roughly, how many?
In the Met, they're under 30,000 for the first time in 15 years. They're less than 700 detectives down. And then they've got increasing workload. And of course, they're really stretched. So the numbers are worrying. And all right, I know money's coming in, but your safer neighbour teams, they used to be ring-fenced. You used to have one sergeant, 2 constables and 3 PCSOs, police community support officers. And they would be ring-fenced to that ward. And they would be connecting with the ward, community action teams, meetings, etc. And they were like an interface regularly, picking up intelligence and some proactive work. But the key things, they were there. Now they're not there. And I think that's a massive blind spot for the Met.
And so you're asking what's different.
Yes.
So I agree with Leroy. Violence itself is as old as Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
But there are some things that have been different and distinct over the course of the last 10 and 15 years. And the thing that's most different and distinct now is the cost of austerity.
Right, yeah.
And that's what we need to be talking a whole lot more about, because it's impacting not just policing, but every facet of public life.
So we're talking the fact that 1.6 billion has come off central government, local authorities between 2010, 2011 and 2016. That's a lot of money.
Well, so something like that quantity of money's come out of the Met budget alone.
Yes.
I don't know the exact figures,
Yes.
but we're talking telephone numbers.
Yes.
And so if you look at policing specifically, there was a report came out last autumn from the National Audit Office, and it looked at policing just in England and Wales. And it pointed out the fact that in the 8 years from 2010 to 2018, we lost 44,000 police officers and staff.
That's nationally.
From policing in England and Wales.
Wow.
So it doesn't include Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Okay.
44,000 officers and staff. And you just cannot begin to pretend that it's possible to take that number of people out of a critical frontline public service and expect to see no change. And so when politicians stand up and try to suggest that there is no connection between falling police numbers and rising crime numbers, they're speaking in defiance of common sense.
Right.
Never mind the professional experience of tens of thousands of police officers.
Sure.
But the point is, coming back to the subject of knife crime, so you've got that huge impact on policing, but at the same time, there have been comparable reductions in funding in youth services, youth offending services, in mental health services, drugs treatment services. And so what you've got is this perfect storm that's gathered in and concentrated on London's poorest communities. I've said and I've written before, and it's more apparent almost with every day that goes by, that the cost of austerity is greatest for those least able to bear it.
Absolutely.
And that's a fascinating point, actually, that it's all interconnected. So what?
And here's one of the interesting things about policing at the moment, and I'm not, and I never have been, a blind apologist for policing. I know you haven't been either. There's stuff policing, both individual officers and corporately, has got monumentally wrong down the years, and it's still capable of getting stuff wrong. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the flip side of that coin, that actually, even as we're sitting here now, there are extraordinary men and women out on the streets.
And you need to tell us a bit about this, because
saving lives.
We don't get, in the same way that the media only paints one side of the story, especially when we talk about this particular issue, but also I think just in the public psyche conscious in the domain, we never get to see the human side of policing. I've been fortunate to work alongside both of you in different capacities, and many other police officers, and even in the church that I pastor, there's police officers there. So you get an opportunity to really see the human side, the incredible things, the things which I will hopefully never see, and the trauma that goes around all that type of stuff.
I think that's a very good point, because, John's just spoken about this perfect storm of austerity and all the inequalities and injustices that we're seeing in these polarised communities, and there's no sign of that gap reducing. It's getting worse. But when you have, as I said, so much less officers, high caseload, and they're responding to these horrendous instances on a more regular basis. And I mean, I don't know about you, but how often did you go stabbing as a constable?
It depended which part of London you were working in, but even working in some of the busier parts of town, nothing like the frequency with which officers are attending now.
Night duty, you might get one or two, but you're not doing regular CPR, or experiencing families distraught. I mean, you'd have pockets of stabbings, but it's normally around where you had hotspots, criminality, your drug dealers, your certain venues, night venues, shebeens, all these sort of places. That's what you used to have. Now, it's any place, anytime, anywhere. And invariably, it's in a public space. People are around, young people, traumatised, and then the officers are regularly, if not seeing open heart cardio.
Well, that's a really good point, because
to be quite honest, I've only seen it once, and once was enough. Much less seeing it every month.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good. There's a guy in my church who I think it was his first week being proper police, proper PC, and I think in his first week he saw like an open heart, like stabbing, and the trauma he went through. So one of the things I want to ask you about, actually, some of the people we've spoken about who's come on PowerTalk, we're talking about teachers, for example. And a few people have said, actually, teachers now need to perhaps be trained not just in how to do academia, but also contextual safeguarding and be trauma informed, because the different type of young people who are now coming into that class of 30 are not all on the same page. I don't think they've ever been on the same page, but it's becoming more polarised. Do you think, actually, and I don't know the type of training which goes on at Hendon or with cadets, but do you think there needs to be a different way that we are equipping our police officers because of the level of trauma, which you've just kind of said, it may have increased in a way which wasn't quite the same when you were like Bobby's on the beat.
Oh, absolutely.
Does there need to be a way specifically with how now people are trained and equipped to become police officers?
Absolutely. And
is it happening?
I think it is generally, and I'll give a couple of examples. I've been working on a youth violence commission with Vicky Foxcroft, who's chairing that commission, and through that work, especially since our internal report, we touched on a bit of adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, everything that we see in communities, but also how practitioners, police, safeguarding agencies have to be trauma informed. And as a result of that, I've been to a couple of seminars where police officers in senior leadership are starting to think, hold on here, this is something. One was that film called Resilience. I don't know if you've seen that or heard about it. It's an American film, and it's analysis of over 25,000 people in quite hard and deprived areas in the US, and how all the ACEs work, but also how trauma-informed practitioners are more attuned to observing how it presents itself from the target group of people you're trying to work with, and also how you as an individual can trigger. Now, as recently as last week, I was speaking at a youth violence summit in Redbridge, Havering and Barking and Dagenham, which are not hottest areas for knife crime, but they are seeing the need to be trauma-informed. Now, trauma-informed work's been going on in schools, but I truly believe it needs to be done in officers, and through Voyage we're doing similar sort of thing.
And just break down, because there's some people who will hear this jargon, trauma-informed, and we hear, there's other things we hear, public health, and maybe not everybody understands, but just in a very simple sentence, what is trauma-informed and what is the difference between not being trauma-informed?
Well, I think it's recognising that trauma can be physical trauma, it can be a psychological trauma, but it has an impact on how people think things through. A person who's traumatised, whatever way, that it can present itself in so many different ways. And from what I've seen of people I've worked with, I've done anti-gang work since retiring, their assessment of risk is so much different. So someone walks through that door and they don't know that person. It could have that fight, flight, or freeze, or dissociate. Those are the four main components. Now, most of us will just think nothing of it. Whereas someone who's been traumatized, whether it's in the home, on the streets, whatever, schools, they will potentially
take on one of them.
Let me tell you a story. I'll tell you a story to try and illustrate what I think people mean by this. So I first started to get really passionate about this stuff well over a decade ago. I was working in West London, in Hammersmith, and a young guy called Kojo Yenga was murdered. He was 15, I think. And he was a good kid. He'd never been in contact with the police, much less in trouble with the police. He came from a loving family. They were refugees from the Congo. He was doing well at school. He had dreams, he had aspirations. And in the middle of the afternoon, he was hunted down in the street by a pack of kids and stabbed to death. And it was just one of those moments in my life and in my career that in some ways changed everything. Because I've often said when I'm talking about this stuff, I don't just approach it as a police officer or a retired police officer. I approach it as a Londoner and as a dad. And it kind of, in its way, shook me to my foundations. And I remember being at the scene of the murder probably a week after it had happened, or the weekend after it had happened. And Kojo's mum came with members of her church and friends and supporters. And I remember standing at a respectful distance as they stood and they began to sing hymns and they began to wail. And it was just, it was a privilege to be there, but I'd never seen or heard or experienced anything like it in my life. And I sat there, and it was in the midst of a whole spate of killings in London, all young guys being shot and stabbed. And I just wasn't convinced that we were getting the response to it right. The calls were always, well, the police need to be doing more stop and search. We need to have tougher sentences for carrying knives. And that's almost as far as it went. It was portrayed as a police problem that was for the police to fix. And it just didn't work for me. I knew that we needed to look deeper. And so we sat down with the local authority in West London and with all of the partners in probation and youth offending and everywhere else. And we said, look, we've got this group of 13 kids who were there or thereabouts when Kojo was murdered. We said, right, let's look at these 13. Let's look at their whole life stories. And let's see if we can find any common themes, any common threads that might help us to understand how they ended up there that day and how they end up caught up in the murder of an innocent young man.
Yes.
And the answers were, on the one hand, not terribly surprising, on the other hand, utterly shattering. Most of them came from broken homes, all bar one of them, and the one who didn't was with a parent and a step-parent, so there'd been some family breakdown in the past. All of them pretty much came from economically poor households and neighbourhoods. Most of them had at some point been excluded from school, and the 4 boys who were eventually convicted of murder, 4 or 5 of them, all of them had been excluded from school. So there were these kind of recurring indicators. But the one that kind of rocked me back on my heels and remains probably one of the most powerful, shattering things I've ever discovered in my policing life was that every single one of these kids grew up in a home where domestic violence was a reality and experienced. And so what we tend to do, certainly what the media and the politicians tend to do, they look at the scene of Kojo's murder and they look at the acts of violence, and that's all they see. And their response is, well, we need more legislation, we need more enforcement, we need tougher punishments. What they don't see is the stories of everyone who's arrived at that place. Now, I would never excuse the actions of a murderer, but understanding is not the same as excusing. And so your question about trauma is that from the very start of their lives, these young boys, and it is mostly boys, have been exposed to levels and frequency of trauma that is beyond the comprehension of most of us.
And I think that it's an amazing point, because I always say that youth violence or any type of violence is never the cause, it's a consequence of something else which we don't see.
It's a symptom.
And it's a symptom, exactly. And I totally agree with what you're both saying. What I'm beginning to see is that there's almost like a dominant youth culture now, which isn't just impacting those children which display or have experienced adverse childhood experiences. It's impacting even those children who, whatever we define as good homes, whatever we define as, the nuclear family. So some of the young people I'm now working with, or I know.
Sorry to cut you. That is not a new phenomenon.
No, it's not new. But the point what I'm making is, it's scary now that I'm seeing people stopped and searched, and they're carrying knives. And when I talk to their families, I'm like, they're saying, I did not see this one coming. They're A-star students and all this type of stuff. So this issue, it's a kind of like, we've got to hold it in both hands that, the traumatized young people are at risk. But I'm now seeing even those who apparently are not traumatized in some...
Do you know, one of the things that's created, the accelerant, because, Johnny talked about this perfect storm.
Good word.
The accelerant to all this is social media.
Yep.
Okay,
so the days when, you could really show your crime hotspots and say, right, there might be some displacement, because the point that John's already said, you're not going to arrest you out of this problem. You're not going to stop and search you out of this problem. This problem is going to be holistic. Similar to, through the Youth Violence Commission, we went up to Scotland, and remember, they were the murder capital of Europe, and they've reduced knife crime by 40% consistently. A few peaks and troughs, but consistently over the last 10 years through Karen McCluskey and John Connigan, and now Niven Rennie, who's the current director of the Glasgow Violence Reduction Unit. When you go up there, you don't get this glossy document saying, right, that's it. First thing, get your head right. How you work together with communities. So, you got your enforcement piece, but you've got to work with the community. You've got to highlight those problems, highlight it with an understanding that the human stories behind this. How did they get to that position? And then addressing it as simple as being it's all around relationships. Relationships are so key to all of this.
John Carnahan, the founder of the VRU with Karen, he's got this wonderful phrase he uses. He says, whatever the question, the answer is relationships.
And I totally agree. And it's interesting you bring up the VRU in Scotland. I sit on the violence reduction unit in London, the reference group with Sadiq Khan. And I obviously, definitely, when you talk about the public health approach, looking at this as a disease, a holistic model, bringing everybody together, I think it's the only way that we can even begin to start looking at this issue. My slight concern, and what I will pick up from the community, is this, two things really. What really made that model in Scotland work was zero exclusions.
Reducing exclusions, yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So, last year in Scotland, only one child was permanently excluded in the whole of Scotland. That played a massive part when we look at school to school exclusion, to people referral unit, to prison pipeline.
Well, the Timson review 2 weeks ago has shown the very same thing.
Exactly. So that's one issue. So I'm thinking, well, if this is going to really work, how if we're not looking at this, then that's a problem. And then the second issue which I have about the public health model being replicated in London in particular is the hyper-diverse communities that we have and the historic issues that some communities, namely the black community, whatever that is, because I don't think we are binary or a monolith, so you've got to be careful there. But how that historic distrust makes
that's a very good
very
point.
difficult to just not that we're trying to copy and paste or drag and drop.
No, you can't do that. You can't do it. You can't do that.
We have to acknowledge that these two things here
but
are...
there are the thing is not to try to replicate, but it's to take the kind of the core principles.
But how do you do that?
And then apply them in the right context. So there are all sorts of obstacles to this working, but I'm stubborn in my hope that I think it can be done.
I agree.
So the first thing is London needs a 20-year knife crime plan. Doesn't have to be exactly 20, but the point is that it's got to be long-term and far longer term than we are currently inclined to think. So we live in a context both culturally and politically that is hugely short-termist.
Yes.
People want this fixed by Friday next week, and it's not going to be. But we constantly cycle back into this short-term approach to dealing with the problem, and it is not going to work. So the first and most important principle that you take from Scotland is that it's got to be long-term. Now, we can do that in London, but it requires the political will, and it requires the vision and the leadership. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's got to be health-based. So it's got to be based on a recognition that violence is at least as much a health problem as it is a crime problem. Like a disease, it can be caught and transmitted, but like a disease, it can be diagnosed and treated.
And contained.
So long-term, public health. The third thing is, and you've alluded to it a couple of times already, it has got to be a partnership undertaking. And if we get this right, it will address, at least in part, the issue that you're raising about police-community relations and confidence. Because you're absolutely right, and it's no good the police sticking their heads in the sand and pretending that it isn't an issue. But our tendency is to say, because we're defining it as a crime problem rather than as a health problem, we're defining it as the police's to fix.
Sure.
The police should not be in charge of London's knife crime plan.
Absolutely. Spot on.
They should be absolutely at the heart of it, but not at the head.
Yeah. Yes, and that is a great
So the first and most important duty and privilege that any police officer will ever have is to save someone's life. And so the police are always going to be in the front line. They're always going to be first in line. And that's exactly as it should be. But they shouldn't be in charge.
But is there conflicting messages? So what we get from our Home Secretary at some point is there needs to be more stop and search. Then recently...
But that's entirely a symptom of what I was describing earlier, which is the short-term panic.
But how does that impact the police officers on the streets? So,
Well, yeah,
and
they take the lead. They, you see, that's the thing. It's such, So Robert Peel, when he set up the Met in 1829, said something so profound but so simple. The police are the public and the public are the police. So a key part of all of that, as I said, relationships. The legitimacy of policing is trust and confidence. So if you are going to be a police service, not an occupying force, you have to have the trust and confidence of all the communities.
And so we circle straight back round to the cost of austerity and what you were describing earlier about this catastrophic loss of neighbourhood policing. So just at the point where we are most needing to build trust and confidence between me and you, I'm being taken away.
Yeah.
Because there aren't enough of me.
Yes.
There is an overwhelmingly urgent need for substantial reinvestment in policing in this country, and in neighbourhood policing in particular.
But just to take the point about it shouldn't be police leading it, I totally agree with you, because, and this is where I'm surprised that the senior officers, chief constables, there's a few across the country recognise, I was in Reading quite recently, see Stan Gilmore and what he's doing there. And his chief constables allowed him to recognise, police are important, but they can be leading from the back, as it were. And the reason why I say that is because the police is a success-driven organisation. So if they see that they're failing on something, they will keep going, belligerent, fair enough. But the knife crime issue is so complex now. As I said before, enforcement is not the only way you're going to deal with this, right? It has to have the partnership approach. But no one's saying it.
No.
There is this denial that, I've seen so many senior leaders saying, it's under control, but you're only dealing with the symptoms. I remember, if there's anything Tony Blair said during his PM tenure, tough on crime, but the causes of crime you've got to be even tougher on. And they're not really understanding that in that sustainable way as you talk about, and in a way that you can evidence how things have moved along.
But you've both said about the importance of the community relationship with the police. So what some people watching this may well view, and when I speak to the community, I don't think there's ever really been an acknowledgement that some of the way that particular communities have been policed has not been helpful. So yes, we've had the McPherson report, but even the review of that has suggested that we haven't necessarily moved that far in particular ways. The point is, black people are still more likely to be stopped and searched by anybody else. The criminal justice system is still overpopulated by black people, even though we only make up 3% in London. So, we can't be responsible for the majority of the crime. We've yet to have anyone come out and say, do you know what? This is a fundamental problem to why there is a distrust between some parts of the community and the police. And for me personally, until we are able to, in the same way we're having a conversation, until we can have a conversation and an acknowledgement that there's been such an historic distrust, I don't think we can necessarily move forward in the way that we want to.
I would like to think that the Home Affairs Select Committee that is reviewing the McPherson inquiry and the recommendations will set.
But how does that trickle down to the average person on the street?
Well, I would like to think they will set the tone to have that conversation and be honest with the Commissioner and all the Chief Constables across the country and really show evidence of where they are. So that, and I hear when the Commissioner says, well, institutional racism is an unhelpful term. Well, it depends how you look at it. I remember when the McPherson inquiry came out and the definition was given. And I remember Lord Condon, who was the commissioner at the time, we said, listen, because we in the BPA were very active at the time, and we said, listen, see this as an aspiration. A lot of those recommendations and those performance indicators were not achievable on the 5, 10, maybe 20 years possibly.
Yeah.
But because they saw it as short-termism, they never really dealt with it. And they saw it as, we've been labelled, and as a result, that means everyone. But it wasn't. If the agenda was written in a way that the media saw it as more as an aspiration, and not, like certain red top newspapers were just saying, it's just political correctness gone mad and all this sort of stuff. If they saw it as aspirational.
The Daily Mail hasn't got a red top.
Thank you.
I do want to say that.
No, say it. This is all right. I own all the rights to this. It's fine. It's totally
he can afford to be sued. I can't.
Here's the thing. I'm the white bloke at the table, and we're now talking about race. And
but we need the white bloke at the table to talk about race. So,
I suppose.
But he's not an average white bloke.
He's a white ally, and that's what I like. So it's okay.
But as I'm approaching my 50th birthday, and really only beginning to learn about some of this stuff for the first time, I'm very conscious of the fact that I've got nothing to teach and everything to learn. But so I've lived in inner London since I was 15, and I have never been stopped and searched by the police. Never. I was stopped once driving my car, but I was driving like an idiot at the time, and the officer had a quiet word in my ear, and I was on my way. Folk like me need to do a lot more listening than we do talking, particularly when it comes to this issue, particularly when it comes to the issue of police-community relations. But I'm trying to write a bit about it at the moment. I'm going to send you the chapter to read.
Please do.
And some of what I'm learning is about the societal and the systemic nature of racism and of prejudice. Now, it reaches a flashpoint, a clash point with policing, because policing sits at the sharp end of the establishment. So policing it meets the community at the places of tension and conflict. But actually, so much of what we see in policing is actually a reflection of what we see in society. So young black men are disproportionately represented in stop and search figures, but they're also disproportionately represented in unemployment figures. They're disproportionately represented in mental ill health data, in prison populations. School exclusions. And the list goes on and on and on. And white folk like me can't pretend that isn't the case. And not only is it a present challenge, but it's a challenge with a huge amount of history.
Oh, absolutely.
And that history informs the present. And policing's got to begin with policing, but this goes far deeper and wider than just policing.
No, absolutely. No, I think the white folks who really need to get this are those ones in political leadership. We know organisations, there's a human, moral, business case. The more reflective an organisation is, the more efficient it is. And we've seen that not just in public organisations, but private and voluntary sector organisations. We are still seeing your Snowy Peak type setups of organisations, and you don't have an organisation reflecting the community.
Why do you think it is that so if we look at the Met at the moment, or in fact law enforcement, the two most senior roles in policing in this country, Commissioner of the Met and Director General of the NCA, both occupied now by women, who are absolutely there on personal and professional merit. I mean, I know them both, so I'm a bit biased, but Cresta Dick and Lynn Owens they're outstanding people. Why are we doing better at gender than we are at race?
And that's...
we may need a part two for this one.
It's been an issue.
Wow.
This is another programme. Because, some people see diversity as gender. They don't see it as race.
Well, people don't want to break it up.
Yeah. Because it's like the Commission for Racial Equality. When it got taken over by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, one of the biggest things we saw was the race element seemed to be on the back burner. And we saw that also how it played out with the Macpherson inquiry, because all of a sudden the Stephen Lawrence steering group, they used to monitor everything, chaired by the Home Secretary. As years went on, got less and less until they disbanded the steering group. I think it was Jackie Smith, the Home Secretary at the time, was the last chair. And then, the chief constables then had to write their own homework through ACPO, as it was then. I know it's the National Police Chief Council, whatever, NPCC. Anyway, so they write their own homework. A lot of it, they seem to focus on gender. Maybe it's the easiest thing to say, actually, we get it. Whereas they don't, and I'm not trying to generalize, but having been involved in trying to ensure that everyone sees it as a systemic issue, not a personal issue. It's not saying every white officer is racist. And it's because if you have processes and practices that have all the disproportionalities you've said in policing, in the wider justice system, education, health, everything, you are going to see themes that date back decades.
But the fight for gender equality in this country, at least, has been longer than race equality, especially in employment. So that's one thing we've got to understand. We also got to look at not just the police, but in any role which is senior management. It's rare that you see a person of colour in. So it's not just
that's Snow Peak,
and you see that in. I've just written a book about this specifically around the church. And unfortunately, the one place like a church where everything should be inclusive and God shows no partiality, as it says in the Bible, unfortunately, we still see these systems, this systematic issue, still play out in church. So why wouldn't you see this in the police? Why wouldn't you see it in banking? Why wouldn't you see it in finance? Why wouldn't you see it in the catering industry? We see it everywhere. So there's a systemic issue in the UK, which then floods
and people
everywhere.
have to be honest about it.
We have to be honest. We've got to have the conversation. Absolutely. And if we don't, we're always just going to be going round. I think there's so much more I would like to talk to you guys about. And I always say this, and the guys filming this always take the mick out of me, because what I'm about to say, I always say we need a part two, because we just start having this conversation. I just want to close. I always like to close on hope. Absolutely. I'm a hopeful person. I heard the Archbishop once say, particularly from a faith perspective, we're not called to be optimistic, we're called to be hopeful. And therefore, I'm just asking the question from if you want to just close on anything, is there any closing comments, where you see this going? Are you hopeful? I mean, don't let me put words in your mouth. You may well be thinking, you know what's going on? I'm not sure where we're going to go. But
I'll give you some hope.
Please do, John.
He's a hope dealer,
Yeah, he is a hope dealer.
So, when we talk about knife crime, and when it's featured in the media, the faces that are shown are the faces of those we've lost. And the stories that are told are the stories of the families who've lost their loved ones. What never gets told is the stories of the hundreds and thousands of other young people whose lives have turned out completely differently. And often, though, having started in exactly the same situation with exactly the same challenges as those we see on the front page of the newspaper. And so my hope comes from the stories of all of those who are triumphing in life. And my hope comes from the stories of churches and charities and statutory organisations who are working alongside these young people and seeing their life stories change for the better. And when I look back over my operational policing career, and I'm now picturing in my mind a particular lad, Stephen, who remains a friend, who I've known for however long. When I think of his story specifically, but when I think of the other stories that I'm alluding to, the one thing that is common to all of them is the power of relationships. Yes. And so where I've seen lives change, it's because the person concerned has found a place where they're safe and where they're loved and where they're believed in. A place that is itself characterised by hope. And not just for a day or for a week or for a month, but for years and years and years and years. We need to, Patrick Regan is a good friend of mine who you know. He used to use this wonderful phrase when he was still working at XLP. He talked about loving the hell out of people. loving people back to life again.
Yes.
And we will fix knife crime in this city and in this country when enough of us care enough for long enough for things to change.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things that gives me a real sense of hope is having people like John, who, similar to myself, have still got that drive and desire to see change. We might not be at the operational end like we used to, making life-changing decisions on a regular basis, but we're still in the mix. And, whatever we can do, we need to ensure we have some sort of hopeful influence. That sphere of influence has to be. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why we're involved in social media, just to get that balance. And the relationship piece, which has been running through all of this. When I leave this interview, I'm going to Hackney, where Voyage is based, and we're having a European youngsters coming to visit us, and we've gone to see them early in the year. So that cross-cultural relationship we're building, because that international piece is something that's so important. And the CEO of Voyage, Paul Anderson, which I hope won't mind me saying, was one of my biggest problems when I was a probationary constable in 1984, 85. He was my worst nightmare. But I didn't arrest him. In the end, it was just banter. You call me Judas. And that's another issue. Some people say, why become an officer? You let down the black community and all that sort of stuff. And that's another discussion.
That's another conversation.
But I turned it around as banter. And 35 years later, we're working together with Voyage. And, I know when you invest time in people, you sow those seeds, you reap a harvest. And I really believe those seeds of hope and expertise and influence, whether it's written form, doing videos like this, really will help people. And I would like to think that people will understand that we're all in this together. That's why, I'm father of 3, grandfather of 3, and I'm not sort of chilling out on a beach somewhere in Africa, the Caribbean, or Asia, or wherever it may be.
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. Well, because I'm still passionate about this. And I don't want my grandchildren, to go through the same fears that my children have, or their generation. So, it's, for me, personal.
And that is, I think it's a great place just to finish. I do have huge respect for both of you. I think it is really important to keep having these conversations. I think it's important, not just on a race perspective, but on an intergenerational conversation as well. I think both of you are...
What he means is you're old.
Yeah.
Both of you are older than me, but you're looking good, so it's all right. But I think even what you said about you guys are both prolific on social media, and it's good. I think it's good that you engage that way as well. I just want to say thank you for your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
God bless you. It's good to see you. And let's just keep talking. And it's been really great to have you.
And it's great you're doing these things, man. It really is important.
Thank you so much. Nice one.